Hey everyone, and welcome to the next lesson of our tutorial series on how to use the cross-platform native plugins 2 inside of Unity. For this lesson, I'll show you how to set up game services such as leaderboards and achievements inside your Unity project. This video and series is officially sponsored by VoxelBusters, who are the developers of the cross-platform native plugins. So make sure that you check out their content by going to www.voxelbusters.com or find them on the Unity Asset Store. In the overview section for game services, it explains that this feature is for accessing the native leaderboards and achievements for both Android and iOS. This feature of the cross-platform native plugin is super convenient because it allows you to submit updates to both leaderboards and achievements, as well as displaying custom or native UIs for both leaderboards and achievements, all while using the same code for both platforms inside Unity. The use cases section for game services explains the benefit of using both achievements and leaderboards in your game, and it talks about creating an immersive experience for both these systems. Achievements are really great to implement into your game because it allows you to further engage the player, and it allows you to reward the player for completing specific tasks. Leaderboards are great because they'll introduce competition into your games, and both the engagement of achievements and the competition of leaderboards will increase the retention of your audience. The section on creating an immersive experience talks about how this cross-platform native plugin allows you to create custom leaderboards and achievements that fit in with your game, rather than just having the default native UI. In the general setup section for game services, it talks about how we need to enable game services in our Essential Kit settings. So we'll go to Window, VoxelBuster, Native Plugin, Essential Kit, Open Settings. And here you can see that I already have game services enabled from when we were doing our cloud services. But we want to expand game services, and here you can see that there's a section for leaderboards and achievements. We'll go ahead and expand leaderboards, and the first thing that we need to do is pick the size of how many leaderboards we want to have. And this is really dependent on how many different values you have in your game that you want to create a leaderboard for. So typically you would have a leaderboard for players' high score, but you could also have a leaderboard for number of games won or even number of kills. For our example, I'm only going to have one leaderboard, and this leaderboard will be for the player's high score. And so I'll give this leaderboard the ID high score, and I'll change the platform ID to the name of my game.highscore. We then have the platform ID overrides where you can input different IDs for iOS, tvOS, and Android, but you only need to do this if you create different IDs for each platform. I can then type in the title, which will just be high score, and then we can move on to the achievements section. First thing that we need to do is set the size of how many achievements we want to have, and you can always add more achievements later on. Now there's really an endless possibility of what you can reward achievements for. You could have achievements related to how many games a player has played, how many kills they've gotten. You could even have achievements for how far they've walked or how high they've jumped, how much money they've made, or what kind of items they've unlocked. For our example, I'm just going to create one achievement, and we'll say this achievement is for getting 100 kills. So I've given it the ID 100 kills. The platform ID can be the name of my game.100kills. And again, we have the platform ID overrides, which you only need to do if the IDs are different on each platform. I'll then type in the name of this achievement, and then we have a value for the number of steps to unlock. If I want this achievement to unlock once the player just reaches 100 kills, then I would just put the value 1. But maybe I could also break this achievement up into 10 steps. So every 10 kills they get notified. And finally, there's an option to show an achievement completion banner, which I'll leave as true. The last section in the Game Services tab is the Android property settings. Here we have the Play Services application ID, which I've already set from when we were doing our cloud services. But just to remind you how to get this value, we want to go to our Google Play console, then want to log in and select the app that we're working on. Then under Play Game Services, Setup and Management, we want to click on Configuration. Then we want to copy the project ID from the top of this page and paste it in here. In the documentation, it explains that the server client ID is optional and is only required if you access Play services from your back end. The rest of these settings we'll leave as default. In the iOS section under Setup, it talks about configuring the leaderboards and achievements through iTunes Connect. So first we'll log into iTunes Connect. We then want to select the app that we're working on, and up at the top we want to click on Features. We'll then set up our leaderboards first, so I'll click the plus sign next to Leaderboards, and here we need to fill out all this information the same as we have it in Unity. For score format, we'll select integer. For score submission type, we'll select best score. For sort order, we'll select high to low, and for score range, we'll select 0 to a really high number that won't be possible to obtain in our game. Sometimes games have a limit on what the highest score possible would be, in which case you would want to set it to that limit so that any value higher than that limit that gets submitted would be disqualified for cheating. And so I'll just copy this number, which is the highest number that iTunes counts to. We then need to add at least one localization, and so I'll click Add Language. I'll then choose English, and I'll type the same name, high score. For score format, I'll select integers with commas. For score format suffix, I'll type point, and for score format suffix plural, I'll type points. You can then set an image, which is optional, but I'll just click Save for now. We can then click Save on our leaderboard. We'll then go on to Achievements, so I'll click the plus sign next to Achievements, and we'll fill out the same information as we have for each achievement in Unity. For point value, it allows you to assign how many achievement points you want to reward the player with, and each game you create has a 1,000 point limit, so I'll just say 10 points. For hidden, I'll say no, and for achievable more than once, I'll leave it at no. We then need to create a localization, and for the achievement localization, it looks like the image is required. And so for now, I'll just set it to the InfoGamer logo. We can then click Save on this achievement. For the Android setup, we want to go to the Google Play console, and we'll select the app that we're working on. Then under Grow, Play Game Services, Setup Manager, we'll select Leaderboards. On this page, we'll select Create Leaderboard. We then need to fill out all this information, same as we have it in Unity. Now up at the top of the leaderboard page, you can see that Google Play automatically generates its own platform IDs for leaderboards and achievements. And so we'll need to select this ID, copy it, then go back to Unity and paste it in for the Android platform ID override. We can then click on the Achievement section under Setup Management, and here I'll click on Create Achievement. We then need to fill out this information the same as we have in Unity. I can then make this achievement incremental, and I'll put in 10 steps. For points, I'll make it the same as iOS, so I'll type in 10. And then we can click Save as Draft. We then need to copy the platform ID, go back to Unity, and paste it in for the Android platform override. Now there's one more part for the setup of Android that we need to do, and that is configuring credentials. Here we need to create a SHA fingerprint for when the player logs in. To do this, we'll go back to the Google Play console, and under Grow, Play Game Services, Setup Management, we want to click on Configuration. We then want to click on Add Credential. Under Authorization, we'll click on Create OAuth Client. We'll then click on Create OAuth Client ID. This will take you to the Google Cloud Platform dashboard, where you need to select your application type. I'll select Android. You can then type in the name and the package name, which is the reverse domain name. For the SHA-1 certificate fingerprint, you can click on Learn More, or in the documentation for the cross-platform native plugin, you can click on AFQ. And here it tells you how to get the SHA-1 fingerprint, which requires using the command line. Once you have the SHA-1 certificate fingerprint, you can paste it in and then click Create. Once you have your Auth client set up correctly, you should be able to use this drop-down menu to select the one that you just created, after which we'll click Save Changes. For the usage section, the first thing that we're going to do is create a new script, which I've called IG_game_services. And we'll go ahead and open that up. Inside this script, we'll need to include two namespaces up at the top. The first is using voxelbuster.core library, and the second is using voxelbuster.essential_kit. Once you have these namespaces, we'll then create three variables. The first is a singleton of this script. So I have a public static variable of type IG_game_services, which is the same as our class. The second variable is for if we've successfully authenticated our account. So this is a public static bool, which I've called isAuthenticated. And the third variable is to hold the local player value. So this is a static variable of type iLocalPlayer, and I've called it localPlayer. We can then initialize our singleton, and we'll do that within the start function. So here I have instance equals this, after which we'll go take a look at the documentation. Inside the documentation, the first thing that we need to do is register to an event, which is onAuthoStatusChange. So we can copy this onEnable and onDisable function, and here I have them pasted in before my start function. Next in the documentation, it explains that we need to check to see if game services is available, and then we need to authenticate. So here I have an if statement where I'm checking to see if game services.isAvailable equals true, and if it does, then we're calling gameservices.authenticate. This function will trigger the onAuthoStatusChange event, and so we need to create the registered function. So we can copy this function from the documentation. We'll go back to our script, and here I have it pasted in. Now inside this function we have an if statement where we're checking to see if the error parameter equals null, which means we were able to successfully authenticate because we don't have any errors. And so inside this if statement I have another if statement where I'm checking to see if result.authOStatus equals localplayerAuthoStatus.authenticated. If it does, then we want to set our isAuthenticated bool equal to true, and then we can set our local player variable equal to result.localplayer. Now after we've successfully authenticated our player, we want to go back up to the start function where I've added in another if statement after we initialize our singleton and before we check if game services is available. This if statement is checking to see if our isAuthenticated variable equals true, and if it does, then we want to return because that means we've already authenticated our player. Now the next section in the documentation is on coding for achievements. And the first few examples of code show you what you need to do in order to obtain the achievement data in order to create your own custom achievement menus. To use this code, you would essentially put it inside a public function that you would pair to the onClick event of a button. Then inside this if statement where you're checking to see if error equals null, there's an array of achievement descriptions which gets populated with all the achievement data that you need. There's then a for loop that iterates through this array, and it's inside this for loop where you would instantiate some sort of UI display for each achievement and then populate the UI object with all the data for that achievement. The next section on coding for achievements is on reporting achievements. Now there's three options for reporting achievements. You can report achievements with the achievement ID, or with the achievement description instance, or with an achievement instance. Most of the time I just use the achievement ID. And there's two examples on how to report achievements. The first is on reporting a one-shot achievement, and the second is on reporting an incremental achievement. And so we'll copy this code and go back to our script. We then need to create a public void function, which I've called report achievement. This function has two parameters. The first is a string called achievement ID, and the second is a double called percentage completed. We can then paste in the code, but we actually don't need the two variables that were at the top of the example because we've made those variables parameters in this function. Now we'll use this function in connection with our singleton variable to report the progress of our achievements from anywhere within our game. Now going back to the documentation, the next section is on showing achievements through the default native UI. So we'll copy this code, go back to our script. Inside our script, all we have to do is create a public void function which we'll call display default achievements, and inside this function we'll paste the code. Now we'll pair this function to the onClick event of a UI button. That way when a player clicks the button, it'll open up the native UI for achievements. The next section in the documentation is on coding for leaderboards, and the first examples once again are for if you want to create a custom leaderboard. And so you would call this code inside a public function that you would pair to the onClick event of a button. And just like for the achievements, there's an if statement checking to see if error equals null. And inside this if statement, we have an array of iLeaderboard. There's then a for loop where we iterate through this array. And inside this for loop is where you would create the display for each leaderboard. You then follow this next section to get all of the reported scores for each leaderboard. But we'll scroll down to the next section, which is on reporting scores to a leaderboard. There's three different ways to report scores. There's with leaderboard ID, with iLeaderboard instance, and with iScore instance. But for the most part, I just use the leaderboard ID. And so we'll copy this code and go back to our script. Inside our script, we want to create another public void function, which I've called report leaderboard. And this function has two parameters. The first is of type string called leaderboard ID, and the second is long called score. We can then paste our code inside this function, but once again we'll remove the variables at the top of the example because we've already added them in as parameters. Now just like reporting achievements, we can call this function from anywhere within our project using the singleton of this script. And so maybe when the player finishes a game, you would take the score that they got and compare it to their current high score. And if the new score is higher than their high score, you could then call this function and pass in that new score, which would send that score to be recorded in the leaderboard. Now the last thing that we need to do is show the default native UI for leaderboards. And there's two options. There's showing all leaderboards, or showing a specific leaderboard with the time scope. And so we'll just use the first example. We'll copy this code and go back to our script. And here I have a public void function which I've called display default leaderboard, and I've pasted in the code. Now, just like displaying achievements, we would pair this function to the onClick event of a UI button. That way when the player clicks the button, it'll show all the leaderboards through the native UI. Now finally, we can save the script and go back to Unity. Inside Unity, I have a new demo scene for game services. And the first thing that we need to do is create an empty game object, which I've called Game Services Manager, and I've attached my IG Game Services script to this object. We then need to create a canvas game object, which I've called Game Services UI. And as child to this object, I've created two UI buttons. The first I've called Open Leaderboard, and the second I've called Open Achievements. I've then anchored these buttons to the bottom left corner of my canvas, and sized and repositioned them so that they're square and next to each other. I've then changed the text objects of these buttons so one says Leaderboard and the other says Achievement, but you would probably want to replace these buttons with icons that correspond to what they do. So for the Achievement button, you could have a trophy, and for the Leaderboard button, you could have a podium. We then want to select the Open Leaderboard button and scroll down to the onClick event. We'll drag the Game Services Manager into this field and use the drop-down menu to select IG Game Services and Display Default Leaderboard. We'll then select the Open Achievements button and do the same thing, but use the drop-down menu to select IG Game Services and Display Default Achievements. Now once again, that only covers displaying the achievements and leaderboards. For reporting the score to the leaderboard and progress on your achievements, first you'll want to make sure that you have this Game Services Manager object in each scene of your game. And so you can make a prefab out of this object, and then it's up to you to call the Report Achievements function or the Report Leaderboard function from wherever you want to report that data in your game. And so once again, for reporting achievements, you're going to use this line of code, which is ig_gameservices.instance.reportAchievements. You pass in the ID of the achievement that you want to report and the percentage of how your achievement has progressed. For leaderboards, you'll use this line of code, which is igservices.instance.reportLeaderboard. You pass in the ID of the leaderboard and the player's score. Now, just as there's not a testing section for the game services section in the documentation, there's not a whole lot that I can show you on how these features work. It's mostly a matter of building your project for each platform, then testing your display buttons for leaderboards and achievements, and playing your game to see if your high score can be reported and your achievements can be unlocked. Now that's everything that we're going to cover in this lesson on how to implement the game services feature from the cross-platform native plugins too. If you like this video, make sure that you give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel so you can be up to date with all our latest videos.